University of California Cooperative Extension and University of California Davis Veterinary Medicine is bringing to you a recording from their March 2024 webinar series. This series was co-hosted by University of California Cooperative Extension advisors Tracy Schohr, Grace Woodmansee, Rebecca Ozeran, and specialist Dr. Gaby Maier. Additional resources from this webinar and other cattle health videos can be found at ucanr.edu/sites/rangelands/cattle health. This session is focused on beef cattle mineral health with featured speakers Dr. Gaby Maier with UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine and Josh Davey, UC Cooperative Extension Advisor.
Okay, so for today, what we have prepared, we just first want to talk about what are trace minerals, what do they do in the body. I want to clarify some myths about trace mineral supplementation. We'll go into some detail about some of the important minerals. So that's copper and slash molybdenum as its antagonist, selenium, zinc. We will talk about considerations for how to design a supplementation program. How do I know I need to supplement, how to supplement, and we will answer all the pre-submitted questions. There we go. All right, so what are trace minerals? So as the name implies, they are only needed in very small amount, in trace amounts. So as opposed to those minerals that are needed in larger amounts, which are known as the macro minerals. So those include salt or sodium chloride, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and sulfur. And they are required in the diet, expressed usually in grams per kilogram of the diet or percent of the diet, whereas these trace minerals are expressed as milligrams per kilogram of the diet. So that is 1,000th of what is required of these macro minerals. So really tiny amounts. And they are cobalt, copper, iodine, iron, manganese, molybdenum. Actually, molybdenum is only in there because of the copper. There's no known requirement for molybdenum in cattle diet. Then there's selenium and zinc. And what do they do? So they're required for a huge number of functions in the body. So anywhere from immune function, growth and fertility. And what this diagram is trying to tell you is that you can't really tell that there is a deficiency until you see clinical signs. So intake has to decline over some time before it becomes apparent, but you already have impacts to all these other functions, to the immunity. So what you would see is probably, what you might consider a vaccine failure, where, you vaccinated for, let's say, respiratory disease, but you still see a lot of respiratory disease in your calves. Or your fertility is not as well or as good as you had hoped. So there were some questions that asked. So how can you tell by looking at your cattle whether you need to supplement? And the answer is, well, by the time you actually look at the cattle and something is apparent where you can actually see it, it's already gotten pretty late. So you don't want to have it get to that point. So it's kind of this iceberg metaphor, where once you're aware that you need to supplement, there is a much bigger problem at hand. So it's also important to distinguish between primary deficiency and a secondary deficiency. And what I mean by that is that primary deficiency is there is not enough intake. So, there's just a lack of a certain mineral in the feed. And those often require extended periods of time until you see something. Secondary deficiencies mean that there may be sufficient mineral in the feed source. However, there is something else that impairs the absorption or the retention in the body. So the classical example would be molybdenum for copper. So if there is a lot of molybdenum in the forage or in the water, it can bind the copper that is taken up with the diet, and it forms these insoluble compounds in the rumen that then cannot be taken up. So there is this famous diagram that is often shown, and you don't have to memorize this or even try and understand it. It looks horrendous, I admit that, but it's just there to show you that it's complicated. So minerals all work in combination, or most of them, they interact. And so, for example, what I just talked about, copper is down here, and then we got molybdenum down here, and they collide here. So they don't get along, so to speak. The same is true for sodium and potassium, phosphorus and calcium. So there are all these interactions. So this is basically just to show you that you need to think of it. You need to think of your mineral program not just as individual minerals individually. So you have to think of it as they all work together. So I just wanted to go over some mineral myths. Do cows know what they need? So do they specifically seek out what is healthy to them? Unfortunately, that's not the case. They're just kind of like us. They would rather just sit on the couch and eat chips and drink soda. So they may have an appetite for minerals, but it's pretty much just driven by the taste. So, and often that is the salt that is in a mineral mix. They don't seek out what they need. So that is sometimes a myth that is believed, that if cattle consume a lot of a mineral mix, then they must have needed it. No, it's basically just that it tastes good to them. So if you realize that you'd put out a supplement that should have been good for 2 weeks, but it's already gone after a week, it doesn't mean that, they must have needed it. No, it just, they just wanted to eat it. You don't have to supply it then for another week. It's fine that most of these minerals are stored within the liver or within other places in the body. And so they don't have to have a consistent intake every day. So, if you keep putting this out every time it gets consumed, it can lead to overconsumption. And that is essentially just an inefficiency and wasted money. It usually goes out the back end and doesn't really give you any advantage. So, you need to sort of pace them. This is a picture of a mineral feeder that's kind of a buffet style. I don't know if anybody does that, but it's not really recommended because, again, they will just pick out whatever tastes good. So do plants that are grown in one area contain the same amount of trace minerals? No, it's complicated. So mineral content in forage that grows depends on a lot of different things. So the pH of the soil has an influence on that. The soil fertility, the stage of the plant maturity. So as the plant matures, it doesn't take as much mineral up. It also depends on the climate. So if it's cloudy, the plant doesn't grow as well. It doesn't take up as much mineral. So just as an example, the pictures here, the picture on the left, have this probably has a very different mineral composition than what you see on the right. It also depends on the plant type. So legumes versus grasses. Legumes are higher in most of those minerals. They're higher in calcium, potassium, magnesium, copper, zinc, iron, and cobalt, while grasses are higher in manganese and molybdenum. So this is just sort of, walks you through all the things that make a contribution to the mineral status of the cattle in the end. So depends on what's in the soil, the pH, fertilizers, soil treatments, what types of plants, legumes versus grasses, how mature they are, what the climate is, and then, it also includes how much water is in the plant. Then what you're supplementing. So what are you adding? How bioavailable are those minerals? And we'll talk about that later. What kind of antagonists are around? And then finally gives you what is in the animal. So the best indicator is in the liver. That tells you what is stored. The serums, or the liquid part of the blood, that tells you what's in the bloodstream, which may not always reflect the true status. So the liver sample is superior to a blood sample. But it's, we'll talk about sampling later on. So blood levels can also be influenced, for example, by estrus, or if there's an infection, the copper level can be elevated slightly. These are the ones, as mentioned before, that I wanted to go a little bit more into detail. So copper, selenium, and zinc. The ones that we don't often see deficiencies are mentioned here at the bottom. So there was a pre-submitted question: how can you tell the first sign of iodine deficiency? And so here's a picture of a calf that has a goiter. So it has this big lump underneath its chin, and it's born premature, hairless. You can also see weak calves or dead calves born. But this is pretty much, that's what you would see in an iodine deficient situation, which luckily we don't really see a lot here in California. So that is great. So some factors that can contribute to this, however, are some feeds are what's called goitrogenic. So they interfere with the iodine uptake. So that would be white clover, brassica, so that's kale, turnips, and rape, if those are sort of, as called vegetables, for example, soybean or cottonseed meal, and then feed high in nitrate can also interfere with iodine uptake. There is, that's the requirement, 0.5 parts per million. We don't have to worry about that right now. We'll talk about pasture sampling in a little bit, and we have resources for you that will state all of those numbers, so you don't have to, write them down right now. There is iodine together with selenium has a requirement for a limit what you can give. And the limit for iodine, or for EDDI, which is a form of iodine that they can mix into a mineral mix, it's 50 milligrams per head per day. So then just
one thing it could add in seeing that, just in some diagnosis local veterinarians have had locally here with low iodine levels, has been things like excessive foot rot that they more than would normally be seen, and then some cases of woody tongue that was more easily occurred from abrasions to the tongue.
Yeah, so iodine can help in treating those, so that's definitely true. That's the treatment of choice for those situations. So iron rarely is an issue. It's especially in beef cattle, and we don't really see a problem with iron. The only time potentially you could see it if they were heavily parasitized, and I mean we've had cases like that, which we shouldn't really have that. We have drugs to treat for internal parasites. So, and I just wanted to mention this picture here. shows some mineral crumbles that have this sort of copper color. And I think it's probably meant to just give you the impression that it has a lot of copper in it. This is actually iron oxide. It's often added for color, and it really does nothing. So it's not even a good source of iron. And the only thing it can do, it can contribute to low copper because it interferes with copper uptake. Manganese, if it's really deficient, we would see bone abnormalities in calves and subfertility. But again, we don't really see that a lot. Cobalt is needed to form vitamin B12 in the rumen. And if highly deficient, you would see diarrhea and also anemia. And we already talked about iodine. All right, so another pre-submitted question was, what are the most important and required minerals for breeding health? So I would say it's copper, selenium, and zinc for bulls, and manganese. So manganese, we already said we're not really that concerned about, but now let's talk about copper. So the requirement is 10 milligrams per kilogram of the entire diet. So it's always important to understand the difference between what's supposed to be in the diet versus what's supposed to be in a mineral mix. So the numbers that you'll see for what we want to see in a mineral mix are going to be much, much higher, because you have to think about that's going to be diluted with everything else that they're eating. So 10 parts per million of the diet. But you also have to take into consideration how much sulfur, molybdenum, and iron is in that forage. And then there are also some breed differences. So Simmental, so if you happen to have Simmental or Charolais, you need to be especially careful with copper supplementation. They need a little bit more because they excrete more of the copper that they're taking in through the bile. So here is an example of what a pasture analysis could look like. So I made these red boxes around what we need to look at. So the copper is at 6 parts per million. And you always, when you look at a pasture analysis result, you always want to look at the dry matter, not as the S-fed. So the S-fed has all the water content still in there, but we really want to have the dry matter that's, so we can compare apples to apples. So the copper here is only 6 parts per million, and we need at least 10, so that's already low. The iron, 125, we want this below 400, so that's okay, but molybdenum here is 9, and we want that less than 2 ideally, in order to not interfere too much. So this is a situation where you have to really think about your copper supplementation. Then this is a water testing example. And well, so here you'd have to look at the sulfates or the sulfur content. And this seems relatively low. So here what's expected, they say this is based primarily on criteria fit for human consumption. So this is not that much of an indicator for us, but here it says possible problems for mature cattle. And these numbers are really more for, you could run into a toxicity issue. But in any case, so the sulfates and the sulfur are relatively low, so that's not so much an issue. Iron is a little bit higher than what we want to see. So, that could potentially be contributing also to copper deficiency. It says 0.3 taste. So water high in iron doesn't taste good to cattle. So that could be a little bit of an issue. And then again, molybdenum is relatively high here. So, the water doesn't help in this instant either. So again, this situation, they really need to look at their copper supplementation. All right, so pre-submitted questions. How can I look at my cattle and tell they are mineral deficient? Does brown hair across the back on Angus cattle mean a mineral deficiency? So again, as I told you, if you can't really look at them and and know that there's something missing. I mean, if you see signs of deficiency, you're already, it's already pretty bad. So hopefully you don't get into that situation. So the brown hair, that, yes, we see that a lot, and that is actually a telltale for copper deficiency, but it's still pretty crude. There's also the issue that, well, what if they have some red Angus contribution? So are they, reddish because they have red Angus in them, or is it because they're actually mineral deficient or copper deficient? So it's always better to test. So this is what a blood test would look like. So I showed you the pasture result, and so this is now a blood result, and this is from the calves of California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab. This is for selenium. For selenium, in order to test for selenium, you need a whole blood sample. So this is has EDTA in it as an anticoagulant. The LGT is for lavender top tube. And it shows you here what the reference range is. So you want the result to be between 0.08 and 0.5 to be normal. And so this animal is below that. While these other two are fine. And this will always be the case, that you're never going to have them all at the same level. There's always animals that don't consume some of the minerals that you put out, but you still want to have an idea of where the herd is in general. Here are the results for the trace element screen that they're offering. And again, here is the reference range for copper. So let's just look at the trace minerals of copper and zinc. And then we have a couple animals that are really below that. In fact, most of these animals are below the reference range for copper. And for the zinc, it's a little bit the same. They're not quite as low, but they're also not within the range. So when you get results like this back, it gives you an idea. You don't really need to look at the individual animals. Oh my God, number 30, it's this low. You always want to sort of look at it on a herd level and think, okay, am I on the target or not? And here, you're not quite on the target. You definitely need to do a little bit better in order to be within that reference range. So here is a picture of Angus, or Angus crosses, but you see this one in the middle that looks at us. She has that copper color, ironically, it's copper color. That is the telltale sign of the copper deficiency. So, you can see all these things: anemia, infertility, diarrhea. But again, you don't really want to let it get to that point. So the depigmented hair, yes, that is sort of the first sign that you would see. So how can you supplement it? So in a mineral mix, there are various forms. So there is sulfate, carbonate, or oxide. And I talked about bioavailability earlier. So that means they are absorbed at different levels. So sulfate is better than carbonate, and both of those are much better than oxide. So copper oxide, which is also the cheapest form, is not well absorbed. So that is definitely something you need to consider when you purchase minerals. What is the chemical form? So organic forms, that doesn't mean it's organic, or organic vegetables. It just means the copper is bound to an organic molecule, like a protein. And those tend to be absorbed better than these inorganic forms. They also tend to be more expensive. There are boluses. We know they're not very popular. But they do give the assurance that if you give a bolus, then that animal is covered for 12 months. There's also injectable forms. There is, multimin, but doesn't really have a lot of copper. And then there's copper glycinate that used to be available, may become available again, but at the moment it is not on the market. So this is a bolus gun that's available from the California Cattlemen's that I really like. And so if you give a copper bolus, so a trick is to write the ear tag number for each animal on the bolus. So then if they regurgitate it and you find one after you're done, you know which one, regurgitated it, which one is missing. And this is just a picture of a tongue, and it shows the tongue has this hump in the back here that you need to get over with your bolus gun. And then I'm going to show how to give the bolus. And, I admittedly, when you have a shoot like this, it's a lot easier than when they can throw their head around and trying to kill you. But if you have a shoot that is very good, it's not hard. And so, you put your thumb in the corner of the mouth so they open their mouth, and you have to put it all the way. Let me just back it up one more time. So you need to really get all the way with the gun into the corner of the mouth before you push the plunger and give the bolus. And yeah, so you can get the bolus gun from cattlemans.org. All right, so zinc. So deficiency. So not a lot of people were worried about zinc. So you should mostly be worried about it for your bulls, because it's important for their reproduction or for their reproductive capacity. So when there's deficiencies, what you would see is things like hoof integrity is compromised, delayed wound healing. So essentially everything that's on the outside of the animal. You don't want to overdo it, though. You don't want to oversupply it, because it is one of those minerals that can interfere with copper absorption. And selenium, which is the one that most people were worried about. So it has an interrelation with vitamin E, but it's not an antagonism. So that's actually helping. So vitamin E can make up for a loss or for a deficiency in selenium. It also has a relatively small window of safety. So again, it's like iodine, it is regulated. So you shouldn't be giving more than 3 milligrams per head per day, which is pretty much what the bolus is designed to release. And these boluses are also available from the California Cattlemen's. So again, if you give the bolus, then make sure you don't overdo it. So don't also give multimin or a mineral mix that has a lot of selenium in it as well, because this is the only one I would say where you need to be careful not to over supplement. So deficiencies, what you could see is early embryonic death. So basically open cows, retained placenta. If you have problems with retained placenta, that could be an issue. Weak calves. In severe deficiency, you would see white muscle disease, where calves would be walking very stiffly. They may also die from heart failure. You may see them breathing really hard, and that's because it affects the muscle, and the diaphragm is also a muscle, as is the heart. So here's another pasture sample analysis, and here we're looking at selenium. So what we would like to see is 0.1 part per million for selenium, and so here we're definitely below that. So there was another pre-submitted question. or several ones. So what pre-mixed bagged minerals should I feed to a feeder calf or steer? What mineral supplements should you feed when backgrounding calves? A best supplement for spring weaned calves going into the winter. And what I wanted to show you was a study here from Idaho where they compared mineral contents in summer and fall irrigated pasture and summer and fall range. And while there are definitely differences for those macro minerals, so for example, for potassium, there are big differences between those. For magnesium, there are large differences. But for those trace minerals like copper, zinc, and selenium, it's pretty much the same. So why I'm showing you this is because for these scenarios that were in that previous question, it doesn't really matter so much what the animals are, and what kind of production stage they're in, or if they're going into winter or not. It really depends more on your location. So every location is a little bit different. So you need to find out, with those pasture samples, with those blood samples, what are you missing? What do you need to be careful about? What do you need to supplement? And where are you okay? And that's how you need to think about your trace mineral supplementation. So it's not so much, sure, there are slight differences between calves and mature cattle, but it gets really complicated quickly. So I think you should really focus more on where am I deficient in the feed that I provide, and how can I take care of that.
So in the presentation, I saw a couple of questions in there, and I think these next two slides will get at what you were looking for in the Q&A. And so if we're looking at it, we want to figure out, what do I actually need to supplement? What am I short on? I think that looking at outside factors such as water in that can be hugely antagonistic, especially high sulfur water and the foothill areas and that from some of these solar pumps, solar wells and stuff that we have. Having an idea of that is really important. The other question, the question in there though, was specifically, how do I test the forage to see if it's deficient? Probably the easiest answer is to send it into Dairy One lab in Ithaca, New York. I caution that though, in terms of that as my decision-making method, in that I'll give you an example. So our soils in Tehama County are hugely excessive in the foothills in magnesium. In fact, it's enough that it limits growth. Yet we still have to supplement magnesium to the cattle because between the soils, the forage, and availability, it's not necessarily there. So what I would suggest is actually testing the animal and not the and not just the forage. There's two main ways to be able to do it. Bar none, the liver biopsy is the best method, and I'll explain why in the next slide. You can also submit a carcass. I would chat with your veterinarian or Gaby on different things that have to do with that. I know in the past when I've done that, I've made mistakes that Gaby's pointed out. So when doing that, make sure you check with them to see what's quite valid and what's not, depending on that. But most of the time, that's a great way of being able to do it because obviously easier to be more invasive with a liver biopsy on an animal that's already passed. The third method, which is the most convenient, is to actually check the blood levels. So if you were going to pull blood samples, you would do 2 samples for each animal. One would be a purple top whole blood tube that you would use for selenium, and the other would be a blue top plastic tube, which gets to John's comment in the Q&A, and actually the one that taught me this to start with. The blue top plastic tube is hugely important in collecting blood samples for the serum portion for the trace element screen, because there is high levels of zinc in the rubber top tubes and the serum separator, so you will not get an accurate reading of what those levels are if you don't use the correct tube. And I know it sucks. Those tubes are a lot worse to use than the traditional tubes, but for any kind of accurate data, that's what you would want. So copper, zinc, magnesium, etc. Trace element screen need as a serum sample. Selenium is a whole blood sample. So one of the things that you'll run into is in considering the differences and when is it practical for you to do a blood type test rather than a liver test. The big difference between the two is, picture this blue box here being the liver, and say we have a full level right here. A liver biopsy can tell you that level's right there. A liver biopsy can also tell you that the levels are down here, where we're nearing low or maybe dropping off. The problem with a blood test is we're not sampling there. We're essentially sampling at the hose when we grab the vein at the end. So if the level is here and we're high, or the level's here and we're getting low, you're still going to get you're going to get a serum test for, say, copper, that's going to say you're adequate, when potentially you may not be, or you're marginal. With that in mind, the trick to having these tests of serum tests be more accurate is to give it plenty of time. Say if you're on on irrigated pasture from spring until fall, or you're on range ground from fall until spring, sample at the ends of the seasons and as you've had the same mineral supplement out for a while. You may be able to pick up quick changes in selenium from a blood test, but you will not in things like copper from a serum test. They still can be accurate on yes or no, still gave you a great idea of ballpark, but not nearly as exact as what a liver biopsy might do for you, though much less invasive. So the reason that the grabbing the samples, whether it's a liver biopsy or a blood sample, is so important. One, in terms of the amount of money that you'll spend on supplementation strategies, it pays off in huge dividends. It's not hard to grab some blood samples to be able to figure out. If you have a chance, grab some liver biopsies when you potentially have a vet out or you have an animal that you send in. But that'll hugely dictate where you go from here. And I can give you some ideas in slides as they come, that are coming up in terms of what deficiencies are where around California. But there are some abnormalities. So say, for instance, in one areas that we've looked at in the Bay Area where there was no mineral deficiency, and we would have assumed by the type of country that it would have been selenium and slightly copper deficient like the rest of Northern California, wasn't the case. And so a huge amounts of money could have been saved and can be saved in supplementation by knowing basically all they need is salt. But for the rest of us that have deficiencies and you've figured out, there are many, there's of the multiple forms. I'm going to try to give you an idea of what efficacy is and how long the duration lasts. So this is an example with the most common, which was the most commonly worried about, mineral selenium, and how products worked. So if you look at the gold bars, this is 30 days after the products were administered. If you look at the blue bars, that's 90 days after they were administered. So the 15 milligram injection was actually a MUSI injection per label recommendations. The 25 milligram injection was a shot of multimin. The product of selenium within both of those products is exactly the same. The dose for multimin is higher. So we see 30 days out, which they both were at adequate level is 0.08. But 30 days out, we see a little more in the multimin injection because the dose was higher. But what we're noticing from the MUSI injection is that the levels are already falling down. There's still bars cover adequate, but it's actually not different than the control. And this was in a selenium deficient site. So the levels did go down. When we compare that to the bolus at 30 days out, it's still at fully adequate. Even at 90 days out, the bolus is fully adequate. And that carries on throughout the rest of the season that we saw. So if selenium is your only issue, you can solve that with one bolus, and know that you have that that problem properly corrected. But notice here, of the 2 injections, neither one of them lasted past the 90-day period. So it's important to think of that as a temporary method of shooting levels up. But what are you going to do from there? Because at least at 3 months, there's no more effect to it. So what about the other most common method of feeding a loose salt? So in this trial that followed up the last one, we compared the bolus as a positive control through the entire summer of cattle that came in June. They were all deficient when they came in selenium. They all received, the positive control group received a copper bolus. The treatment group was a loose salt mixture that received salt through the summer, and then the blue treatment was a control. So notice that through the summer, the control always stayed deficient. Obviously, our pastures were deficient, and both treatments were higher than the control group. But you also notice that at some points through the summer, here and here, they were lower than what the copper bolus was. The reason for that was actually the summer heat. And there may be ways to be able to combat that, to sweeten up the mineral. In this case, this mineral was a straight salt mix, so salt was definitely a limiting factor. But when you looked at intake levels of the mineral, where we actually measured consumption, these levels right here directly match what herd level consumption was through the summer. So it says that it can work. It's also a selenite version. It's not a chelated version. But I think the big take home with this is it needs to be out in front of them all the time. There's a lot of thoughts out there that will just worry about supplementation, mineral supplementation during the breeding season. And this says that you need to keep up with it because it's important throughout the season, and the numbers can decline quickly. And remember that when you have when you're hitting, even if you have a cow in a dry cow, she's also bred, so that needs to cross the placenta. So hugely important to keep those levels up through the season. What this is this is a survey that I did throughout Northern California, and Grace was on, and Siskiyou, all the way from Grace all the way down to Rebecca's area, actually, and everywhere in between. And important to look at with this chart, this is not a chart of what's low in terms of what would be deficient in the counties. This is or in the areas. This is a chart that shows what's deficient with the current mineral programs that are happening. So take the Intermountain and the Northern Foothills regions, and 3 and 4% of the cattle supplemented or sampled in those areas, 3 to 4% were still deficient in selenium. That actually shows we know those areas are deficient in selenium. It shows the mineral programs are absolutely working. So a lot of these salt mixes and stuff that are out now are working actually considerably well. And we've been hammering selenium home for quite a few years. But taking a look at the central region, it kind of shows maybe we need to take a little bit more look at adequate methods of being able to supplement it there. One thing we did throughout the course of this trial was record exactly what they're supplementing and try to get an idea of intake to go along with it. And one thing we found with the Southern California groups is most of them were not supplementing besides white salt blocks. And notice we only had 2% low in selenium. It's generally not a problem in Southern California. In fact, there can even be places where there can be selenium accumulating plants. But what we did run into, even more than the North State, is copper deficiency. And this is probably an area to focus on and look at testing. And as mentioned before, the blue top tubes are huge for doing that. So a little preparation, you'll probably, if you wanted to sample for those, you'd want to be looking at it in advance because most feed stores aren't going to have the blue top tubes on hand. You'll have to order them. Your vet can order them. Usually your suppliers can order them, but they'll need a little time to check on it. The unsung part, mineral that I thought interesting across the board was this zinc level, where we go anywhere from 35 to 47% of herds deficient in zinc. And interestingly, even those that were addressing, say, copper and selenium, where we know most of these occur in deficiencies in these areas, the mineral mixes were doing a good job at hitting those copper and seleniums, but they weren't necessarily in all cases doing a good enough job at hitting zinc levels to bring them up to adequate. So I think it's an area we can look at, and I'll touch on that on the next slide. In terms of looking at if you're looking to design these, and I'm going to go through them in a little more detail, but I think this is a help to try to look at what does it actually cost. So in two of these cases, Musi and the selenium bolus, it says just bolus, but it's a selenium bolus. We're looking at one mineral supplementation that essentially just solves your selenium problem. It doesn't solve if you've got zinc or copper or something else, but in a lot of cases, this is your only problem. And if you did this and a few white salt blocks, you actually could be fine through the season. Important to test to make sure that's true or not. But to give you an idea of what you're looking at, so the Musi shot requires 1 ml per 200 pounds as opposed to the multi-min 1 per 100. Remember, we showed the multi-min was actually a higher dose of selenium. So say that's good for at the most, and we see even at 30 days it was falling. You're looking at $3.30 a cow to actually treat them one time through the season. Obviously, you would need something else to be able to follow that up with to keep numbers at adequate levels, as opposed to a $4 bolus. So granted, the shot's a lot easier to give. I personally hate giving boluses, but it's absolutely effective. And at $4 is a pretty cheap method to be able to do it. The other comparisons that we have are the mineral sources that are able to give multiple minerals at a single time. And realize with the selenium bolus, you can also give a copper bolus. So if you only have those two as your worry, that might be a good option for several reasons. One, where I would look at it as a comparison, if I have those two and I'm not able to do something like get the cattle in to give them another shot, or say I'm on the Devil's Garden and I'm short of copper and selenium, but I can't put out a bunch of mineral all the time on that kind of range ground. In that case, the boluses make a lot of sense, because you at least know you have those two fixed at a fairly reasonable cost of $4 a head. So going back to the first multi supplement method, the multi-min, note that at 3 months, you are deficient in all minerals given. The timing on the other three, as opposed to selenium, is probably less than even the 30 to 45 days that you get out of the selenium. But you at 670 a cow, remember, you're going to need to multiply that by 3 or 4 to try to get enough into them for the season, even just for selenium. The other option is the loose mineral, and this is actually taken at a price of $22 a bag. So retail price off the shelf at a local feed store for mixes custom made for the area that I'm in. So it's not the cheapest mineral. It's set for 1 ounce per head per day, but it's one where you know that it works, and that comes out to a cost for all supplement at $10 per head per year. So the idea with this is just to give you an kind of an example of what costs might be to you. And in looking at it, are these products bad? No, they're a great way to know instantly that you have something brought up to speed. But these two probably more for the longer term. So in looking through that survey where we saw the deficiencies and recorded what were you giving and what's still deficient, we kind of came up with an idea of what it might take in terms of what you're looking at. If you look at a mineral tag and say, what does it need to say on it so that I can actually tell whether I'm supplementing this mineral adequately or not. And it's important to note, and I'll show a few examples, that this is based on a 1 ounce per head per day consumption. So at that consumption rate, and I'll give you some comparisons, if I was looking at a selenium supplement based on the data from this and then a lot of data that we've gathered through the counties, I would say you're not a selenium supplement unless you're at better than 100 parts per million of selenium. Note the max that Gaby mentioned before, that would be 120 parts per million to be FDA legal. In terms of copper, this is where it's probably worth taking, the sampling is worth quite a bit, because in marginally deficient areas where there's not some kind of an antagonist, you probably are good with somewhere in the range of 25 to 3,500 parts per million if they're eating it at the salt mix at 1 ounce per head per day. I put an exception in the notes of sometimes can take up to 6,000, and this is where the water sample and those kind of things might come in. 6,000 would be in an area where there's some kind of an antagonist, like high sulfur in the water, the kind of water you drive by and it smells like rotten eggs in the water trough. Those things can inhibit copper enough that you need 6,000 parts per million. But I highly caution, if you're going that route and you don't need it, you can cause toxicity problems. I have seen folks that have problems not with cows at levels this high, but actually with calves that sat and overconsumed it and had some death loss in it. So make sure you need it before you give that much. In general, for most marginally deficient areas, 25 to 3,500 is plenty. And then from what that trial looked at, what we kind of found as target levels for zinc supplementation was around the 5,000 to 6,000 parts per million area. Then looking at iodine, and lower levels were even on a lot of back to the zinc, lower levels were a lot of times seen at 2,500 to 3,500 where they just didn't quite meet the adequate mark. In terms of iodine, and John asked this question earlier, we are able to sample serum sample iodine levels through the Michigan lab, the equivalent of our CAFS lab, can run serum iodine samples. This is the max, I believe, is 800 parts per million you can put in there. We had limited samples, so a small data set that said that's probably where you want to go in terms of what those were. I caution that at this point, and that the sample size is so much lower than the selenium, copper, and zinc that I would wait for more data before taking that as gospel, but it certainly won't hurt to do the max. We did not see excessive levels from anything that was around that range, and we did see lower levels from cattle in a similar area that were far below that. And then magnesium, generally like to see it at 1% of the 1 ounce per head per day mix. Gaby can speak more to what you'd want to do if you're looking at the springtime and worried about grass tetany, if that is something that is a concern. But in general, of just making sure that lab analysis shows your magnesium levels are okay, around 1% seem to be the magic number. So in bringing this back to the real world in this 1 ounce per head per day consumption, so I like to use that as the base reference range. And I say, based off the data that I've got in the bank, that you need better than 100 parts per million in a mix with 1 ounce. Well, what do you do if you're looking at a liquid supplement like a lot of folks use? Well, oftentimes you'll see that they'll have 3 parts per million of selenium, which seems extremely low, but remember that you're comparing 1 ounce with something that's only supposed to supplement salt and micro minerals versus a liquid supplement that's supposed to supplement protein primarily and then minerals as a secondary. So calculate your consumption, and you can get that based on what the refill rates are when you get your bill, how many head per day, how many days, and try to get an idea what your consumption is, because that can bring you back to that greater than 100 parts per million from 1 ounce. So here's an example. say they were eating 3/4 of a pound a day on liquid supplement, which is pretty common. If that value is only 3 parts per million and on the selenium tub for the tag for that, if you multiply that 3 by 12 ounces or 3/4 of a pound, that's 36 parts per million when compared to the 1 ounce per head per day mineral mix. So is that a selenium supplement at that point? No. The answer for this to reach over that 105 parts per million mark is 2.2 pounds per head per day. So tracking that level of consumption is huge. And the way to be able to do, so you can track the level of consumption fairly easily from your rep that does the refill on those, or maybe you buy them yourself. Track that based on when you're out. In terms of loose salt, the way to be able to check it is there's 800 ounces in a 50-pound bag of loose salt. So one bag of loose salt mineral should feed 800 cows for 1 day or 1 cow for 800 days. And you can split out the numbers in between there to try to get an idea of what that consumption is. And we've got a little bit of data to show you on how that varies within the herd. But again, to kind of take a look at this, if you look at a standard mineral tag and you're looking for a selenium supplement and you see it at 82 to 137 parts per million min and max, is that a selenium supplement at 1 ounce per head per day? Yes, that's absolutely the targets you're looking at, and you'll probably be fine. If we take a look at another tag that's at 42 to 57 at 1 ounce per head per day, is that a selenium supplement? No, that would be low. But they're different they're different minerals. Notice what we see up here, monensin, and I got a quick slide on the addition of monensin or rumensin brand in mineral. This is likely not targeted to be a mineral for 1 ounce per head per day. This is probably a mineral targeted to be at more like 2 to 3 ounces per head per day. So if we take 40 and multiply 40 to 50 and multiply that by 2 to 3, are we over our 100 ounces per or 100 parts per million per head per day? And the answer is yes. So that's what you'd want to take a look at. And again, here's the example from a liquid feed supplement tub, and it's 3 parts per million. Is that low? Well, it depends on how much they eat. And the point of this first is that it's a 20% protein supplement that somebody's probably feeding in the fall or in the summertime as well, to try to encourage consumption of dry feed that they otherwise may not eat. So the next question you'll run into, and Gaby hit on this already, is the idea of chelated versus the inorganic. And the question is chelated better? And the answer is yes. It's also more expensive. So there's differing levels everywhere from up to 13% more bioavailability from the chelated mineral. And what I would check with that, which may be a little more difficult if you're not actually formulating it, is the expense part of it, because it is it's highly more expensive on the chelated. It's also, if you want to avoid some of those ups and downs that you saw in the slide that I showed earlier through the summer, that's also a way to be able to avoid that. The chelated is going to be more bioavailable, and also might be a way to be able to bring it up quicker. If you have some calves weaning that you might be worried about, or haven't fed for a while and want to be able to bring the levels up, that's also an idea. But I wouldn't shy away from something that is a blend of chelated and inorganic. So something that might be 50% chelated selenium or yeast, and the other half being selenite. That's probably actually going to work just fine. In terms of looking at those inorganics, Gaby mentioned this before. Big point, if you take a picture of this slide or they show it later, I think this can be helpful in looking at the tag. Oftentimes you'll see cheap minerals with things like copper oxide, which essentially aren't mineral supplements. Note that the sulfates are generally always pretty good across the board. So if you've got something that's, say, half chelated and half sulfate, it's probably going to be pretty bioavailable. And and fairly economic. One thing to take a look at in terms of the supplement program is looking at a way to be able to gain some bonus added weight through the use of an ionophore and mixing it in with your mineral mix. And Gabby and I and Larry Ferrero have done work for the last 10 years. Is it that long, Gabby? Maybe 6, 8, 10 years on finding different ways to be able to get rumensin into them through a mineral mix. And so what we have is in a mineral mix, low, medium, and high amounts that were treatments, as opposed to the controls. And please disregard this for that. That's a typo that's in there. And essentially what we found by being able to add this to the mineral mix is roughly across the treatments about 25 pounds more gain through the season. And that was fairly repeatable over years when the right mix was when we came up with it. It's not rumensin is not a palatable product. So you do have to work with a nutritionist or your farm advisor to find the right way to come up with a blend to be able to get them to actually consume enough to realize the benefit. But this roughly gave us 50 milligrams per head per day. Gabby, is that about right? I think when we with these 3 weight gains, the part I thought that was hugely economical as we did it added cost over what we did for the mineral per pound of weight gain. We did it for 1 to 2 cents per pound. So if you figure now, even at that set of calves that was at 800 pounds when we finished the trial, even at $2 a pound, which in the last couple of weeks has been on the lower end, we made somewhere around $50 per head just with the use of that ionophore over top of our costs. So pretty cheap method to be able to increase that. One thing we are finding is low was about 800 grams per ton, medium was about 2,000, and high was about 3,000. They went off mineral at 3,000 enough that we couldn't sweeten it up for them to eat enough mineral to the point where we actually saw selenium decline. So somewhere between 800 and 2,000 grams per ton was probably the sweet spot. So quick considerations if you're going to feed rumensin. I don't know if you can afford to have a horse that you don't like anymore, but if you don't like him and you feed him this, you will solve that problem. It is highly toxic to horses. And then, that is a valid concern because it's so easy to put out mineral in a corral or something if it's a central meeting place between pastures. It's easy to refill there and different things, maybe next to a water source, but it's also where you'll leave your horse overnight when you're gathering. So that would need to be planned on in advance, as well as probably don't want to store the horse mineral and the cow mineral if it's got rumensin in the same place in the barn. Just ways to be able to make sure that you never make that mistake. And then the other trade-off to it is feeding the rumensin in the mineral does not, it takes you out of most of the branded programs, including natural. So you'd want to take a look back at and see, are your premiums from the branded programs making you roughly $50 per head, as well as what added benefits you may have from using an implant, and weigh that out in your marketing program. And maybe it works and maybe it doesn't for you, but definitely a consideration to see. So one of the things that we'll see, and this is blood sample here, that we run into all the time is, did they actually eat it? And the problem is we don't have grow safe machines on pasture for cattle to tell individual consumption. But we did find a way to be able to take at least a kind of a general look back and see how many of them are actually eating the mineral and coming up to levels within the herd. So is it 50% of them are eating? Is it 80? Is it 90? And look back through a lot of data sets several years ago to be able to see what that actual level is. And the reason that we can do it with selenium is that we know the whole blood test works fairly quickly, and we know we feel confident in its accuracy, and we feel that if we are selenium deficient, that in these cases the supplement we're putting out works. And then we also knew that the area that we were supplementing was deficient. So in terms of looking through this data set to get these numbers, if those assumptions weren't true, they weren't included in this to try to be able to get an accurate idea. I thought the results were pretty interesting because what it showed was that 6 to 8% of them did not eat it. And particularly our numbers of those that didn't eat it were on irrigated pastures as opposed to range ground. They weren't hugely different than the bolus numbers that we had. For some reason or another, either we applied wrongly, something happened with the bolus, but essentially the bolus and the loose salt worked fairly similarly if the loose salt was in front of them all the time. The part I found interesting, and we were able to track them through the trials where we had multiple samplings throughout the year, is in many cases, it was the same one throughout the trial that didn't need it. And you could tell that because unlike his herd mates, his blood level stayed similar to the control throughout the trial. So one of the things we find interesting on that is lower consumption was much less likely on rangeland. Seems like at first it wouldn't make sense because there's a lot farther to roam. It's easier to go to the mineral tub when you're in a 20-acre pasture at a time like you'd see on a rotationally irrigated pasture system, as opposed to rangeland where they may be out on 1,000 acres. But feed's never limited on the irrigated pasture, and that's probably the difference. Most of these mineral mixes have a little bit of grain, actually the bulk of it is a grain component, with salt being the limiter. So they're going, when forage quality or quantity is lacking on rangeland, they're going after the mineral at that point. But the take home is that it does work. So what are some of the factors that we've seen that can contribute to consumption? And first and foremost, look at the salt content of the mineral. If it's 20% or less, salt usually isn't that much of a limiting factor. So you're kind of looking at a mineral mix that's encouraging consumption. If it's 20% or less, 3-4% or 3 or 4 ounces per head per day are very likely. If it's lower than 20, it could be even higher than that. 60% salt or more are probably going to limit it to about an ounce per head per day. Similarly, will straight salt, where we did see in that summer where we had no other factor for limiting no other grains in it except salt, where we did see when we got into the hot summer months, they did go off of it a little bit. Soil fertility may cause lower salt consumption, but it also could cause an antagonistic factor, particularly when irrigated pastures are highly fertilized with ammonium sulfate. Remember, sulfur can inhibit the uptake of selenium. And one of the big reasons why that can become a factor, it's not always because usually we're pretty deficient in sulfur on irrigated pasture, but pastures only need 12 to 20 or so pounds of sulfur a year. But we don't put ammonium sulfate on for the sulfur content. We put it on for the nitrogen content. So oftentimes we do 3 times what the pasture actually requires, which makes it pretty available within the plant because it's going to be high at 2 or 3 times the rate that it needs. Heat we mentioned before, and then the rangeland example of if they're limited for protein and energy, probably going to see a lot more hitting that. They'll be more apt to be hitting the mineral more. And that goes back to Gabby's earlier comment where take a look at what they need. If you put out 2 weeks worth and they ate it in a week, wait 2 weeks to put it out again, and you should be fine. Salt, both ground salt and water salt, I have seen instances up north where that is eliminated mineral as an option to have any kind of a salt loose mineral, because they're naturally getting so much that any kind of salt is a limiting factor. So that might take some critical thinking to figure out how you're going to solve a problem if you have high levels of that in either your water or ground. Freshness of the mineral to me is important because I don't think that you get the same consumption after 2 weeks. If I had the perfect world, you put enough mineral out for a week at a time. I know that can be hard on some of these sites, and you look at rains coming up this week and you just won't get there. But I sure don't like to do any more than 2 weeks supply at a time, because even though they'll consume it when it gets wet and it's been out for 2 weeks, they seem to really go off of it. There is consumption differences. You're looking at 10% more consumption with a loose salt versus a block, and then hiding it in some location where they can't get to it probably isn't the best idea, though they do tend to travel to go find it. And so that part's at least helpful. In terms of a quick look at vitamins, there you can test to see what your vitamin A levels are like in the cows. I caution you that if you do, you have to protect those samples, keep them out of the sunlight, and probably talk to somebody that's done it before to make sure that you get that sampling right. But could be in a situation where if you're on dry land a lot of the year, you could end up being vitamin A deficient. I definitely check. Vitamin A is absolutely probably not a problem. Absolutely probably. That's a university talk right there, but likely not a problem. If you're moving from range ground in the winter time to summer irrigated pasture in the summertime, you're probably fine because you always have green grass in front of them, which has carotene, which leads to vitamin A, and you'll be fine. But where I would look at taking some samples to note is if you're on range ground only and you calve in the fall, say you're calving in October, and then you wean calves when the forage turns in May or so, you may have a problem because of how much vitamin A is lost in the milk that cow's using for the year. And then by the time you wean the calf, you've already lost the green feed and the carotene available. I'm not saying that it would definitely be a problem, but it's worth checking in those levels. And there's a lot of instances in California where that exists. And one of the things you see in a lot of minerals is some vitamin A in it. But I caution you this, it's usually so little that it's expensive and not worth your while. Definitely not worth your while if you're on green grass all the time. But to give you an example, those guys in the Midwest that are used to only having 1 or 2 months of green feed and know they've got cows on them there, their mineral mixers are supplementing vitamin A with 600,000 ppm. If you look at most of the mixes in California, we're doing 80 to 100,000, maybe 200,000. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to what they need. That may be fine if you know you're deficient and you combine it with an injection once or twice a year to jump those numbers up. The longevity of that it can be questionable, but it's sure better than nothing if they're deficient in it. And if you keep cows out of the barn, they probably don't need vitamin D. And Gaby spoke on the vitamin E and selenium relationship before. So, Gaby, do you want to come back and take a look at some of the questions we've got here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a question about grass tetany. How do I know when to put out extra mineral to prevent grass tetany? So grass tetany is also known as hypomagnesemia, and that happens, well, right around now when there is lush green grass available, which is high in potassium, but potassium unfortunately prevents magnesium uptake. Josh, feel free to chime in. I have heard about this usually in highly fertilized pastures. That seems to really be an exacerbating factor, but it's it's somewhat unpredictable when it happens. So on range, I think on range, it's not as likely to happen. What you can do to prevent this from happening. So what you would see in the cattle is they are restless, they are kind of twitchy, they are easily startled. So those are kind of the early signs, but they can also die from this and relatively quickly. So there have been train wrecks where you find, a number of cattle dead. So this is definitely something that can be devastating if it does happen. So what you need to do is provide a mineral with a high magnesium content. So there are special mixes that say high mag, and they have a much higher percentage of magnesium in it. Ionophore, so what Josh mentioned earlier, the monensin can also help with avoiding this hypomagnesemia. Salt needs to be available. It helps with magnesium uptake. And if you are calving, if you're spring calving, or if you're calving right around now, then your cows need more magnesium just postpartum because they're making a lot of milk. And so that then they're more vulnerable to this as well. Alfalfa, so a legume hay like alfalfa, can also help with preventing this grass tetany. So it's not so much that you need to put extra mineral out, you need to switch to a different type of mineral. And when, again, if you want to check your pasture, that, to see whether there is a reason to worry about, what you want to look for is, again, is magnesium, the magnesium level. So if it's less than 0.2% in the forage, that's a red flag. If the potassium is high, over 3%, that's a red flag. Or if the crude protein is really high, over 25%. That can also be a red flag. How to use mineral supplements preventatively and how to support the health of aging cows was a question. So, I mean, I think we probably drove home the idea that supplements should be used preventatively, that they shouldn't be used when, you're already thinking that, oh, I have a deficiency. No, you should use them pretty much year round to make sure that you're not running into any problems. And then how to support the health of aging cows. So I think, a lot of cattle health really comes down to very simple things, good nutrition, good water sources, or make sure at least, that they have a consistent water source. Make sure you're up on your core vaccines, have a mineral program that includes periodical testing. And then for aging cows, you could also introduce a wellness check. For example, at Prec Check, have somebody there that checks for things like lameness, cancer eye. You have the vet there. Maybe, if you have somebody that's their job, is to just look at the eyes, make sure there is no cancer eye. And if there is one, the vet maybe can take care of it right away before it gets really bad. Teeth issues, lumpy jaw, woody tongue, we talked about that earlier. Chronic weight loss. So, just make sure you periodically, or, at Prec Check at least, or whenever they go through the chute, you check for these things to make sure that they don't get out of hand. When will a multi-trace mineral bolus be available, similar to the ones in Europe? Well, that was an interesting question. So I don't know the answer, and it may not be for a while. But I did reach out to a manufacturer of a multi-trace mineral bolus in Europe, and this is what they answered me. So there are two issues with that. So one, it seems like there needs to be some sort of regulatory process to bring this on the market, and that is complicated. So, a company really needs to make that investment, and that is difficult because it's a lot of money at stake. And then also this particular company at least thought that the distribution system in the US is not what they are hoping for. So they don't think that the distributors here are marketing the products as well as they are hoping for.
And there have been some products in the past that have come onto the market, but they were none of them lasted on the market very long before they were pulled.
Ah, okay. And are they pulled because they don't sell well enough, or because there are other issues?
No, I think it was regulatory.
Okay. So what is the most efficient and economical protein supplement? And this is actually, I asked Josh what he thought about this question. And so he gave the answer, well, the best is just to use alfalfa. It seems like that is much more cost effective than to provide protein tubs or any of that sort. If labor is an issue, that's the only exception. If labor is an issue, then a tub can make sense.
So back to that tub part, Gabby, actually, that's a hugely important part in finding the consumption because, and why the alfalfa is usually economical is I can buy alfalfa now laid in for $150 a ton. The tubs are going to cost 800 plus. So alfalfa at 16, 18% protein, as opposed to a 20, 25% tub. It's not hard to do the math to divide by 4 or 5. But the trick is if you want to feed at least once a week, preferably 2 to 3, if you can feed that alfalfa as a protein source. Remember, you're not feeding energy, you're feeding protein. So it's much less than the diet as opposed to when we typically think we need to feed them 15 to 30 pounds an animal, depending on what class it is. You don't need to feed that to use it as a protein supplement. But if you want to be able to throw the tubs out in the wet season, you can't get there, put them out earlier. It's really important to do some trial and error on them because most of the tubs consumptions are set during the curing process. And some companies even have a gradient on consumption levels, and they're designed that way. So I've heard some brands get naysayed because they didn't need it, but it's actually was their most limiting form that were the tubs that were bought. So that's important to look at, and to trial and error with your own herd. Because if you're targeting 1 pound of consumption per day, you can easily get a half pound of consumption a day, or 3 or 4. So you have to figure that out based on what tubs are available locally. And then I would look to make sure you go through vendors that once you figure that out, you can keep with the same one, as opposed to lower cost tubs that may go in and out and have no limiting factor at all. So sorry, that was just some thoughts I had.
Very good. Thank you. All right. What is the most cost efficient and most effective way to supplement cows that are deficient in copper and selenium? I mean, I think we kind of answered that, I hope. So bolus is efficient, as you saw with the selenium bolus. It did provide the best, the most efficient supplementation. They remember that diagram where they stayed at the highest level of selenium. However, again, you're not going to get anything else in them, right? So you don't get any of the other minerals in. So zinc, for example. So it's usually better to give a mineral mix unless you know that this is the only thing that you are deficient of. Multimin, we know it only provides selenium for 30 days. It gives a small boost for these other minerals. So it is probably not the most efficient way to do it.
So we're talking about copper. Is it safe to feed copper around sheep? Josh, you talked about the horses, but what about if you're running sheep with your cattle?
Well, just like feeding Rumensin to a horse, feeding copper to a sheep will solve your sheep problem, and you'll be back in the full cow industry. So I would not. That's a big no-no.
Yes. So the sheep are very sensitive to copper toxicity. So do not give them the same minerals as you give your cattle. That will end in disaster. Are cattle in Southern California deficient of a specific mineral? So again, it just depends where you are. There can be differences, small differences within small areas. The U.S. Geological Survey has this map of, this is soil. So, and again, there's a big difference from the soil to the plant to the cattle. I mean, there are many, many variables involved here, but it can give you, sort of an idea. And, when you look at this map, we see the central coast here is very dark, and this is selenium. So we clicked here on selenium, and we know, and this is the area where Josh in his survey saw that very few cattle were deficient in selenium, regardless of the supplementation, and that's just the case here. So, this, don't use this to determine your status, but it can give you some ideas of what to look for.
And we will include this map as part of the follow-up or this link so you guys can use it as more information. And then a question that we did have on that relating to Josh's city, Someone asked if there was any statistics on Amador, Calaveras, or Tuolumne counties.
No, we didn't have a farm advisor there at the time when we did those studies, so we didn't. But we did see that by and large, the predominant mineral deficiency in Southern California was the copper to address. So I would start with that one and go from there.
Does drinking water high in iron change the cattle's desire to consume trace minerals in loose or tub form? So I would say no, but there are other issues with that. So high iron, as we mentioned before, can lead to copper and zinc deficiency. So it does interfere with take up of those minerals. And then high iron, sulfur, or manganese can decrease the water intake because of the taste. So they don't like the taste of those. And then Josh mentioned this, high salt content of the water can limit limited mineral supplements. So if the water is really salty, then they lose their taste for more salt in the mineral mix.
And so just on that, there was some questions about where to get testing done. And so we can provide information on where to get water testing done, which can be done at CAPS lab. Also on the information that Josh said about testing hay, pasture, and soil. And if you want to do the blood testing, get that information out as part of the follow-up resources to this session.
Right. Yeah. So Dairy One does water and pasture testing. As well as CAPS lab.
And one thing on Dairy One, they're a very reputable lab, but also even though it sounds intimidating to ship something to New York, on most of the forage stuff, they're so much cheaper than other labs that it makes up for it. So don't be worried about shipping it that far. And the CAPS lab for the blood samples is amazing to work with.
Yes, absolutely. I think for the pasture sample, so what I showed you, that panel, I think it's $35. The water testing that I showed you, I think was $42. So it's definitely reasonable. Can you give too much mineral supplement to your cattle herd? So, it depends, of course. So, I said everything is a toxin depending on the dose. So most of the products, especially the ones off the shelf, I don't think you can overdo it unless, again, it's you feed something to sheep, you feed a cattle product to sheep, or there is, an obvious mistake. But just by putting it out, it's very, very unlikely that you risk a toxicity unless you have one of those custom mixes like Josh pointed out with the 6,000 parts per million of copper, and you're not really in a copper deficient area. Sure, yes, that can lead to problems. But overall, if again off the shelf, it's unlikely that you would run into that. But it is a waste. It will, more is not always better if you do not need it.
And the only thing I would add to that, Gabby, actually non-mineral wise, I would check on, I would definitely caution lick tubs on clover ground on irrigated pastures that are high in clover. That excess proteins cause some fertility problems, actually quite a few times around. So I would not recommend feeding a protein tub in high protein clover pastures.
Okay. When should I feed loose mineral or lick tubes? Well, so as we said, and as you saw in that study that Josh did with the selenium, they can drop off fairly quickly. So it's really recommended to, if you are in a deficient area, to use it year round. You could, play with it, like Josh pointed out, with some chelated versions versus the inorganic versions. Or you could use chelated minerals in that time, late gestation through breeding, when it's particularly important to have good mineral supplementation. So, nothing is written in stone, but overall, there isn't really, you can't just do it at certain parts of the year and then nothing for the rest of the year. That's probably not going to be,
And kind of
that's probably going to
similar,
run into problems.
I'm sorry, did I cut you off,
Go ahead.
Gabby?
Yeah, go ahead.
And kind of a similar question that Hector had in the Q&A, and that was that he's currently feeding Anapro 20 or 25% liquid protein tubs. Would you recommend switching to loose salt? Is there more to gain from one or the other? So my answer with that is both products are roughly the same cost, and one's feeding in ounces and the other one's feeding in pounds. And the difference being, and whether there's a difference that makes that worth your while, is do you need that protein? So, and a lot of times when we get to mid-February like we are now, the feed's actually starting to come on. Granted, different if you're on the coast or something like that, but if you're in the valley, we're looking at late February, early March to actually start growing grass. We don't need the protein supplement, as opposed to in the fall when we're looking at a bunch of dry feed where there is inadequate protein. By feeding the protein, you can feed the rumen, which lets you eat lower quality forages. That's where it probably makes sense. But if you've got adequate forage quality and you don't need a protein source, you're going to save a lot of money by just feeding a loose salt at an ounce versus 2 pounds a day.
Exactly.
And on that, Josh, there was also a question. When you talk about loose salt, does that include salt blocks?
No, the two reasons. One, you're looking at a 10% increase in consumptions of loose salt over the salt block. The other reason is most of the time, if you take a look at the salt block, it doesn't meet the levels of actual supplementation levels that I showed earlier. And oftentimes it's an inferior product like a copper oxide or something that's in them. Even the iodine blocks, I remember Dr. Moss mentioned before when they looked at iodine studies and iodine blocks and having lower levels than prior to receiving the block, just because it took so much saliva to actually consume a block. So I would consider blocks a salt supplement, not a mineral supplement.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, what I have looked at, at places like Tractor Supplier. So if you look at the blocks that are offered there, yes, often it's the copper oxide that's in them. They, it's better than nothing, but it's not a good mineral supplementation program. There was a question about a supplement that also provides parasite control, while also maintaining health of the soil or range. And if so, would it qualify for all natural and non-hormone treated cattle programs? If there isn't a supplement, what would you recommend? So it depends on what you consider parasites. So if you consider external parasites, then yes, there is something called insect growth regulator. So there's a product called, for example, Justifly, that you can just add to a loose mineral. And at least according to the manufacturer, and that, this is just the Justifly, so you have to check with everything. It does, according to them, it does not affect dung beetles. So this is basically just for flies that lay their eggs in manure. So horn flies, phase flies, not the biting flies. They gave me a certificate that said it meets the requirements for all these programs, non-hormone treated, verified natural, et cetera, et cetera. If you talk about internal parasites, there is a protein block. I'm not aware of a mineral product that the protein block that has safeguards. So that's fenbendazole, so that is for internal parasites. However, so that specific product, that would be heavily restricted in organic production. I'm not sure about natural, or I could only imagine it would be okay for non-hormone treated because it isn't a hormone, but you really need to check with your program. And if you're just looking for something that spares the dung beetle, moxidectin is known to be more friendly. So that's marketed as Cydectin, is supposed to be more friendly to the dung beetle.
And just a quick note on that IGR, the Justify and those related products. They're expensive. They could easily double the cost of your mineral program, but they are a lot more economical than a fly swatter. But the other thing to note with them is they're as good as the area that they're in. So if you've got 5 acres of irrigated pasture and you're feeding just a fly, you may not be producing more flies, but if your neighbor isn't feeding it, it's probably not doing you a lot of good. So it's a product that shines when you don't have a lot of neighbors adding to the fly problem, or if you do, get them on it too, and everybody get on the same page, and then it can really work.
And then I think this is the final question, and I'm sorry we ran a bit over. What are some things that you wish you knew when being introduced to beef production health? And so I just wanted to say this: the most important way to maintain production health is not with a syringe. So I mean, I usually tell people, you know, when I talk about vaccines, for example, you can't really vaccinate your way out of bad management. So I know people like to, you know, give a shot and think everything gets better, but you know, I'm just going to come back to the previous slide that I had with, if you care for your cattle with, you know, good nutrition, good water, if you just, you know, make sure they get what they need. It's just like with us, you know, being healthy, it's really not that, it's not that difficult. You need to eat well, sleep well, exercise, and avoid stress. And so it's pretty much, I think, the same for cattle. I don't know, Josh, if you have any words of wisdom for this question.
No, I think for me, the thing looking back that I wish I'd have known prior is has far more to do with culling than it does with animal health and that kind of thing. Because the textbook always tells you to sell them, and they're really expensive to replace. And we all have that pet that we want to keep around for another year when we're at preg checking. And definitely better to get rid of her than to keep her, because it's going to happen again. Even though she gets fat and gets bred the next year after that, she won't. But the other part is the culling during drought. It's easy to wholesale get rid of them, and it's really hard and really expensive to replace them. So finding the right balance of combination of both and what you can actually afford. I wish I'd have known that before I had to go through it, because you just don't know what your finances are like before that. So you plan for the worst, and that's not always the best case.
So that was, I think, the last question that was pre-submitted. I don't know if we have any more that we haven't addressed yet.
There's 2 quick questions in the Q&A. One of them is, can you just confirm that the copper and selenium boluses can be administered at the same time?
Actually, yes, in the same gun at the same time in the same bolus injection.
There's no issue.
Perfect. And then there was a question about that they are going to process a steer, and he is 15 months old at 1,300 pounds and has been getting cob and alfalfa. He's been out of the field for 3 months. Could I still get a valid, useful liver biopsy to represent my herd that's still in the field?
No, he's been off the diet for too long of what the field would be.
And another one on diagnostics, other than the goiter, how can one assess iodine status in California? What are the diagnostic opportunities or capabilities?
There's serum sample through Michigan State's animal health lab.
Yeah, the calf lab doesn't do that, unfortunately.
Do they ship it out for you if they do get a neocropsy in there?
No, you'd have to request it.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for them. That may be the case. I'm not sure.
And we do have a webinar on our slide set that talks about the diagnostics lab, and so we can look into that as well as that as a resource for those of you who are on this session.
I think there was one about small scale production. I'm not sure if we covered. Is it recommended to feed pre-mixed minerals that are included in the hay ration if you, let's say, 1 to 5 steers, or is free feeding the minerals separately still fine?
You can do either one, but if you've got a full TMR, I prefer to set it up actually and do it really differently. If you're doing if you're feeding everything to them, I do prefer in that case to test the feed and actually balance it based on an NRC recommended guideline that they have. So say you've got some bulls you're feeding out, or steers in the back in the 4-H or FFA steers that don't have a forage-based diet, then I'd dole it out as a ration. And then in that case, yeah, I'd preload it and mix it in the grain. But you can do it the other way too. It's just that's more precise.
Thank you to Dr. Maier and Josh for sharing with us details on beef cattle mineral health. During the video, there were references to resources and other webinars. You can find those at ucanr.edu/sites/rangelands/cattle health. Thank you for watching this webinar recording that was brought to you by University of California Cooperative Extension and University of California Davis Veterinary Medicine, and was co-hosted by University of California Cooperative Extension advisors Tracy Schohr, Grace Woodmansee, Rebecca Ozeran, and specialist Dr. Gaby Maier.